Hello, and welcome to the Port Huron Statement. Today we're going to be talking about paper tigers. I call this one federal agency or paper tiger, when government protection becomes government cover-up. So, today we're going to follow up on my recent episodes on learned helplessness and gaslighting and controlled opposition and gang stalking with another critical point in this design dysfunction, which is the paper tiger agency or bureaucracy or whatever may be applicable. These are government entities that exist to create the appearance of accountability, of safety and security, regulation and justice, while actually protecting the very systems that they're supposed to be fighting. They're called paper tigers because they look fierce on paper, but are in reality harmless to the individuals that they are supposed to be hunting. And there's the disturbing truth. Some of our most trusted federal agencies function as paper tigers when it comes to protecting the most vulnerable or when it comes to going after the most powerful in our society, regardless of the nature of the crime. A paper tiger agency has several key characteristics, which include the theater of action, pretending to have a genuine and determination to achieve stated goals and integrity in the pursuit of those goals. Though they create the theater of that, but not the actual reality of it. They hold hearings that generate headlines, but there rarely are consequences. Issue reports that document problems, but recommend no meaningful solutions. They create new policies that sound impressive but have no enforcement mechanism. So a great example is the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. The protection racket, they provide legal cover for the very entities they're supposed to regulate. This is a good example with the Federal Reserve and, oh my gosh, what is it called? FDIC. But obviously Security and Exchange Commission, and over again. Throughout history, the FBI, let's be real here, the FBI has continually, intentionally failed to protect people based on political motivations and refused to prosecute people based on financial incentives and, again, political motivations. J. Edgar Hoover and the entire history of the FBI is a history of prosecuting thought crime and engineering society through decisive political action more than being a criminal justice anything. Look at his life. Look at everything about the FBI. There's really nothing about its history with the exception of that brief period of time with Abscam, where it actually was legit. The FBI's history is pretty abhorrent. And that really does serve as it's weird because it's a paper tiger in the case of real crime being committed against vulnerable people by powerful people, but the FBI is very much so a real tiger if you're not extremely powerful or effing over vulnerable people. And apparently you can just advertise your financial scams right on YouTube. They'll never figure it out. They create bureaucratic barriers that prevent real accountability. So creating websites and bureaucracies that accept really complex forms and submission formats that ultimately make the data unwieldy or disencourage people to actually engage a report or tip them off to any crime that may be committed, which is part of the design. They are not meant to actually police what they claim to police, rather to create the appearance of doing that. They serve as a shield between corrupt actors and genuine law enforcement. So this happens over and over again too, where essentially the whole will protect the bad actors. We see this where law enforcement personnel will murder someone and yet get full protection and support from the entire law enforcement community. So the truth doesn't matter, it's about your status. That's what is being said by those instances where law enforcement protects their own regardless of context. That is to say that in our society, they are pushing for not rule of law, but rule of hierarchy. So the fact that they killed someone that's beneath them in the hierarchy means that they are ultimately not guilty, and that as law enforcement officers at this juncture in American history, they expect the right to murder someone beneath them in this hierarchy. And they are exercising that right continually. They legitimize criminal behavior by treating it as regulatory violations, or by sanitizing responses as necessary. Again, lethal force and absurd scenarios being justified. The intelligence gathering operation. You know, we shouldn't be in a situation where when a police officer goes on duty, there is more of a liability to the personnel around him than to him by him being on duty. Like, the danger to a civilian near a cop is greater than the danger to a civilian not near a cop. And the danger, the cops are causing the violence and the problems, I guess is the point. While not actually doing anything to prosecute the primary criminal elements that are devastating our community. They collect evidence that could be used for prosecution, but then don't act on it or even bury it or redact it, pretending that there's a national security issue or some reason why the public can't know about it and why prosecution can't be affected. And you can't know because to know would make you less safe. Stuff like that. They identify victims and witnesses and fail to protect them, ultimately subjecting them to harassment and reprisals and leaving messages to other potential whistleblowers, victims, or anyone with a conscience that if you dare speak up, we'll make sure to out you and make sure to punish you for it. They map criminal networks, then allow them to continue operating. I wonder what we can think of there. We are at a point right now with this Epstein thing where, I mean, there have been non-governmental actors that have been able to elucidate enormous amounts of information regarding the Epstein situation. You know, we know what's going on in terms of what the Epstein situation is really about is the collective interest of a bunch of powerful people overwhelming the best interest of millions of people. And just the best interest of intelligence, humanity, and logic and reason itself. I mean, we are defying logic itself with the way that we are orchestrating this society. They become repositories for information that never sees the light of day. And also, like, they use publication and slow leaks to give the veneer of transparency and effort, but in reality, those are just meant to function as pressure relief valves so that they can slowly actually reveal the truth without having to suffer ramifications or repercussions. Because if they slowly release the information, then they can constantly be managing it, and it won't result in the large social response that it should. And so what a paper tiger is really about is not just failing to respond to an unjust situation that necessitates the agency response, but beyond that, functioning really as a tool to conceal the injustices through the popular assumption that they're being dealt with by these agencies. You assume that if you report to them, they're going to do something about it other than help the people that are committing the crimes, which is really what they're doing and what they're meant to do. They're designed to do at this juncture. Nothing else could explain how we got to this juncture. Historical examples. The pattern revealed. Let's look at some clear examples from American history where agencies function as paper tigers. The SEC with Bernie Madoff, which Bernie Madoff actually did get prosecuted in the end. So this is kind of a weird example because even though they didn't function as they should have, they ultimately did because of the people that he screwed. Because there are a lot of Ponzi schemes like this, and a lot of them even ripped off pension plans, like teacher pension plans in Kentucky, a bunch of pension plans even in this day. So the Madoff thing is kind of an interesting example, but at the same time, the truth is that there are much worse examples of similar levels of financial exploitation that are harder to name because the SEC has effectively squashed them. We could just anyway. So in the SEC, whose entire job is to prevent financial fraud, was repeatedly warned and tipped about Madoff. In 1992, the SEC investigated Madoff. And they even though there was plenty of proof of wrongdoing, they ultimately come to the conclusion that there's nothing wrong. Then in 1999, the financial analyst Harry Markopolos provides detailed evidence that Madoff is running a formal Ponzi scheme. And then 2000, 2001, 2005, 2007, Markopolos continues to dump evidence with ever more detail to the SEC regarding Madoff's organization and the mechanism for financial manipulation. In 2005, the SEC conducts another investigation, but doesn't find any wrongdoing. And in 2008, Madoff can't maintain the Ponzi scheme, and so he ultimately confesses. And that's really what, because he's protecting his family by doing this, because by confessing, he's kind of controlling the narrative, and so he's able to shield his family, they were all clearly implicated in this shit. But that would allow them to maintain, to silo their wealth from his criminal shit, so they could keep a good piece of money that they really have because of his Ponzi scheme, and pretend like they earned it. It's all salaries and stuff related to organizations and businesses that were built on the Ponzi scheme money. So his confession was really a brokered thing that benefited him, really, and his family, and allowed them to keep a lot of the money that they stole. The SEC had everything they needed to stop Madoff in 1999, and really, you could argue much before then. Instead, they protected him for nearly a decade while they stole $65 billion from investors. That just tells you how wackadoodle this money is. $65 billion. And there are... How much time is spent investigating shoplifting and petty theft? It's inordinately more than the amount of time that's spent on these things. In fact, the SEC spent time doing the opposite of investigating this, actually covering it up and coming with excuses to cover it up while $65 billion were stolen. This is not a rational or logical society when we put billions of dollars in pursuit of millions of dollars while 65 billion are stolen under a paradigm that could have been prevented without any effort from the SEC. So how do you rectify these things? It can't be in terms of dollars, because clearly the dollars aren't what are motivating the investigations, because these SEC crimes involve enormous quantities of dollars. It's about the class and status and maintaining the hierarchy as it is. So the reason that they are investigating people that steal petty amounts of money is because they're stealing it from wealthy people that own these large businesses. And so the apparatus of state is disproportionately geared towards satisfying those wealthy individuals that have carved for themselves a larger portion of the social support network. So despite the fact that they have less need for subsidization and government assistance, they get ever more government assistance, though it's not called government assistance, it's not viewed that way, even though it is that way. Like Donald Trump's bankruptcies and all that stuff, that's millions and millions, probably billions of dollars in government subsidies and assistance. And people that are getting hundreds of dollars a month are looked at as though they're ripping the government off. Just the tax manipulations alone represent far more money in theft from the federal government than any of these entitlement programs other than Social Security will ever drain from the federal government. So ultimately, I guess the point is that any institution that is meant to investigate the wealthy is by definition a paper tiger. And any institution that has an opportunity to investigate and prosecute someone that isn't wealthy will cease to be a paper tiger. Unless, of course, it is politically advantageous to pursue an investigation against someone in these higher echelons of our society, the protected sort of status in our society. The case is Epstein, where cutting Epstein off like a necrotic limb was what happened there. That wasn't them actually investigating and prosecuting someone. That was them cutting off a piece of tissue that was going to kill the whole body if it didn't get cut off. Anyway, so why was it that the SEC investigators didn't do a better job investigating? Well, it turns out a lot of those investigators got jobs at firms that did business with Madoff, and there was this established revolving door between regulators and businesses that were profiting off of his bogus investments. So the incentive was to keep him operating because it was financially advantageous. The EPA and environmental disasters, the EPA is a great example of a paper tiger. The EPA has a clear pattern of protecting polluters rather than the environment. A good example is Love Canal. You have to remember Nixon created the EPA. The EPA knew about toxic waste contamination that was making families sick, very sick, and causing teratogenic problems, kids that were born with major deformities. But initially downplayed the risks and opposed relocation efforts. It took so many sick kids born with deformities for Love Canal to be acknowledged. And, the chemical industry in Ohio was just dumping so much, Ohio, right, or Pennsylvania, just their waste without any oversight whatsoever. Flint, here, the EPA knew about Flint lead problems. And really, Rick Snyder was key in covering that up because ultimately Rick Snyder's business had a lot of contracts that were with the Great Lakes Water Authority. So the pipeline that was built from Port Huron to Flint to replace the Flint water source from Detroit City Water necessitated temporary use of the Flint River water source, which was their former water source before this transition. The transition really was about giving Rick Snyder's business millions of dollars in contracts to put in a pipeline that would cost more than the cost of continuing to use Detroit City Water for like 50 years or something. But they decided to do it because it would make Snyder a bunch of money, and then made a bunch of kids really sick, and they kept hiding it because it would make Rick Snyder a bunch of money, and the kids that were getting sick don't have the voice that Rick Snyder making a bunch of money has. So the EPA became a paper tiger in order to convenience a project that someone who alone is, by the standard of our government, more important than literally hundreds of thousands of kids, was given his pipeline and his millions of dollars, and never to be prosecuted or even considered culpable in this. Even though, as who said it, the buck stops here, that was not Truman, but was it Truman? It's Truman. Buck stops here. It doesn't matter. That's a good mentality. If you're in leadership, you're fucking responsible. So not only was Rick Snyder responsible for failing to protect people in Flint from poisoning their water, but he was the cause of it. And rather than doing anything to fix it, he covers it up and profits off of it. And kids died. So, I mean, there's no way to slice it where he's not culpable for multiple child deaths and for money. So, he traded child's lives for personal profit. And it's looked at as somehow ethical, not even considered immoral or newsworthy. That's Paper Tiger. Let's see. The 9/11 response and the health of the Ground Zero crew, despite knowing that 9/11 and the World Trade Center disaster had caused the aerosolization of enormous quantities of toxic substances, this was kept from first responders. And also, first responders have continually not been given any health care as they've gotten long-term consequences from this. Thousands of first responders and residents later developed serious health problems. In each case, the EPA had the authority and information needed to protect public health. Instead, they protected government and corporate interests. Then we can go in the FDA and the opioid crisis and TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which is probably the worst thing that ever happened. Probably one of the worst things that ever happened, really. Because by kicking tens of millions of people out of their homes, they made them vulnerable to this constant cycle of having to pay to live, for rent, to stay somewhere, which creates a lot of survival stressors that make people more vulnerable to exploitation and exploitive, income opportunities. People that are in a survival state are more likely to do things that are ethically compromised, and that's the exact reason why we have a society that is intentionally making people more housing insecure, so that they're more politically malleable and more socially controllable and more desperate and eager to do things against their own best interest and the best interest of the entire population, but to satisfy the upper class in their grotesque appetites. Multiple agencies failed to prevent the 2008 financial crisis despite having the clear authority and overwhelming evidence. The Federal Reserve knew about predatory lending, including millions of defrauded applications for loans. The housing bubble risks, and refuse to use any regulatory powers. In fact, they use their power to access the press to do the opposite and to try and bolster the real estate situation, pretend like nothing was wrong. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency actively prevented state attorneys general from investigating predatory lending. So the subprime mortgage thing and these loan officers and the issuance of loans that were bad. I mean, it's so predatory. It's just crazy. Then there's the Office of Thrift Supervision, allowed savings and loan institutions to engage in increasingly risky behavior. And then the SEC failed to investigate mortgage-backed securities fraud despite whistleblower complaints. And, I mean, they were packing in all of these troubled assets into packages to these pension programs and screwing over cops, teachers, firefighters, all these people that are depending on their pensions. Tons of them, they don't really exist because the Wall Street took all of their derivatives related to these subprime mortgages that they knew were going to be bad and gave them to all the pension funds for the blue-collar government workers. I mean, they offloaded literally trillions of dollars in troubled assets, and that's never talked about. And then on top of it, all these banks, they weren't prosecuted for the fraud that they caused, because all of that was based on fraud. Like, they were selling houses that the people couldn't afford knowingly and defrauding their own banks, knowing that the Fed would just pay them back in the long run, which did happen. Ultimately, everyone gets kicked out of their house, but the banks get paid for the houses by the American people, and then they resell them slowly so that they appreciate back to the value that they had when they were originally purchased. So they actually make, then they get to resell the house. They actually make more than double the money this way, because they get paid on the principal of the first house, and then they get to foreclose on it. Then they get paid for the full value of the house they issued loan, and then they get to resell the house because they still own it. So, it's like a 2.5x. So they get to profit immensely and charge the American people for that profit, despite defrauding the American people and causing the largest global financial crisis since 1929. So the fact that the SEC not only didn't prevent it, but then also didn't do anything at all except for prosecuting one bank, Abacus Bank, one of the smallest banks in the country. It just services Chinese fluent speakers in Manhattan, and they had one loan officer that was defrauding loan applicants, inflating their capacity to repay the loan out of like quite a few, like a couple dozen or something. They had the lowest rate of fraud out of all the banks that they could have investigated by far, and they prosecuted Abacus Bank because it was small enough and because it was all about Chinese customers. It wouldn't create the political and media backlash that would be leveraged if they went after a big bank that serviced, well, I guess white English-speaking people. I don't know. I think that the Chinese part definitely played a role, because if it was a small bank of white people, then it would have been easier to leverage the media and say we're being targeted. It didn't work as well for the Chinese appearing and Chinese fluent Abacus Bank, but the way it all goes down, there's actually a frontline about this called Small Enough to Jail. I advise it because it shows you actually that Abacus Bank was probably the most honest of all of the banks operating in 2008. It's crazy. And then they get prosecuted, of course. And then part 3 of this little thing on Paper Tigers is about the child protection charade. Now let's talk about the most disturbing paper tiger situation of all. Agencies that are supposed to protect the most vulnerable in our society, most notably our children. The Department of Justice and Child Trafficking. The DOJ creates task forces, issues reports, holds press conferences about fighting child trafficking. But look at the results. The Epstein case. They knew about Epstein's operation for decades before finally acting, and then Epstein mysteriously dies in federal custody before he can implicate his network. That was orchestrated. Nexium, only prosecuted after years of public pressure and media attention and innumerable pieces of evidence, incidences, ritual abuse, same thing, child sex trafficking. And then the local trafficking rings are consistently uninvestigated. The only type of crime that they seemingly are willing to prosecute are the lone wolf, gotcha type internet traps. They don't want to involve themselves in any of the larger orchestrated child sex trafficking networks, because to do so would be to interfere with what Carvel calls the Pandora's box. That is about $60 million in non-disclosure agreement-related settlements, mostly to hush minors that have engaged in sexual activities with congresspersons. Yeah. It's like 60 million every 2 years, I think. Okay, we'll just do this. Then there's CPS. CPS agencies across the country follow a disturbing pattern. Remove children from families based on false reports. Fail to remove children from genuinely dangerous situations despite legitimate reports. Place children with foster families that have histories of abuse. Create bureaucratic barriers that prevent family reunification. Isolate children from their parents and create barriers to communication. Generate massive revenues through federal funding tied to child removal rates. And then to create these charities and businesses that then, feed off of that money that is pumped in to relocate the children. In many cases, CPS functions more like a child trafficking organization than a child protection organization. Then there's the FBI and institutional child abuse. The FBI has jurisdiction over crimes that cross state lines, including organized child abuse, but their track record is telling. USA Gymnastics, Larry Nassar, the Penn State investigation, the Catholic Church, the 2x2s, the LDS, the Rajneeshpuram. I mean, we can go on and on and on and on. The Finders, North Fox Island, the Franklin scandal, P. Diddy. We can go on and on. The Weinstein. It's all integrated. It's all integrated. So how do legitimate agencies become paper tigers? This is a surprisingly systematic process. It begins with regulatory capture. Industry insiders get appointed to leadership positions in regulatory agencies, like-minded individuals serving like-minded agendas. They bring industry perspectives, industry priorities, and industry relationships. And this industry can be a lot of things. It's a general term. It's just shared interest. So instead of maybe industry, think of it as interests. Key indicators. Agency leaders have previous careers in industries or related interests they now regulate. Agency policies consistently favor industry or specific interests over the public interest. Agency staff frequently leave for high-paying jobs in that industry or related to the interest that they were supposed to be policing. Industry has unusual access to agency decision-making processes, and this constantly happens. And then what else is happening in the case of the child abuse networks is over and over again, like the Finders. The people that are committing the child abuse actually have more leverage over the prosecution of child abuse than the people that are supposed to be investigating it. And that takes acquiescence by the agency operatives themselves and complicitness in their leadership. There's also congressional interference, which plays a big role. Congress controls agency budgets and has oversight authority. This creates leverage points for special interests. Budget cuts that prevent effective enforcement, oversight hearings that intimidate agency staff or cloud the narrative, legislative riders that restrict agency authority. I mean, think of the Church Commission, all these things that came out of that, and then Title 50 stuff, confirmation processes that screen out reformers. And then there's the revolving door. What we're talking about before is the fact that these people are going from the industries and interests that they're supposed to be policing into the agencies and then back. And then we can go on to the concept of mission creep, which is these elaborate bureaucracies that develop multiple layers of approval for simple decisions and simple actions and are designed to only enable large actors to even gain access to a subsidy or a grant or this and that because of the amount of overhead and red tape associated with even applying for it. It's designed to specifically only allow one entity or specific entities to ever gain access to those funds. Oh, there's just so many issues. And then the biggest problem is that our intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies that should be picking up the slack in the case of these paper tiger agencies and actually investigating wrongdoing and finding ways to prevent ongoing, massively socially harmful issues like what we are talking about ultimately is, things like exploited networks like the Weinstein Network. That's what gets enabled. And TARP, ultimately everyone loses except for a very narrow number of people that are orchestrating these social failures to their own benefit and to enable their continued exploitation of people that are poor and unable to protect themselves from the machinations of the wealthy that have dedicated themselves to subjecting anyone without the resources that they can to abhorrent contempt. That's what it is we are being led by people with contempt for us. Why do we subject to leadership by inept and contemptuous actors? It's a bunch of crybaby boomer brats that are entitled and have no empathy and no intellect, that are running around telling people what to do. And it's been destroying this country for decades. We can't continue to let these baby boomers ruin our society. They have no integrity. They've allowed all these institutions to become the playthings of industry and large moneyed interests. There is nothing of authenticity that's left. It's been drained by baby boomer brat bullshit entitlement interests and their unwillingness to actually face up to their own fucking actions and have any responsibility whatsoever. It's not just them, but geez, it's mostly them. They're in the positions to do things and they do not. They just orchestrate legislation to allow them to gain better access to Viagra. That's what the boomers are mostly concerned with. I don't know if you noticed, but there has been a significant movement toward easier access to nitric oxide agonist drugs that enable long-lasting erections in old men. That medical access we have achieved now in 2025. Thank the Lord.